Just a quick note on the um, psychology of Carl Jung, the archetypal psychology of Carl Jung. Jung was always reminding us that archetypes are unconscious. We can only infer their meaning, infer their true nature, their essential nature, by reference to myth and symbol, by reference to artistic motifs and religious figures. We can never know an archetype full stop, right? We experience qualities that we associate with archetypes, but the archetypes themselves withdraw from their appearances. Now, Jung was a good Kantian, right, most of the time, in the sense that he made this distinction, this epistemological distinction, ultimately, between the realm of phenomena, that which is studied by natural science as he understood it, and the realm of noumena, or archetypes, or the realm of things in themselves, beyond experience, beyond cognition, that metaphysicians try to pretend they can talk about, but that ultimately we have no direct access to. We necessarily and universally, that is, we must infer the existence of these things in themselves, says Kant and says Jung in his Kantian moods, but we cannot know them. We have no direct experience of them. So I bring this up because, with Jordan Peterson popularizing Jung's ideas and politicizing them, bringing them into the realm of gender and sexuality, I think what the tendency has been is to believe that we know what the archetype of the masculine is in its essential nature, and we know what the archetype of the feminine is in its essential nature. And I don't know to what extent, Peterson is a sort of fully on board with Jung in all the phases of his development, or at least in all the moods of his own cosmology. Because there's Jung the Kantian, and then there's Jung the cosmologist, the alchemist, Jung the metaphysician, who when he started talking about synchronicity, and the psychoid, and the way that psyche and cosmos are bound up in this deep, this profound way that prevents us from ever, say, reducing consciousness to the brain. I don't know to what extent Peterson goes all the way there with Jung, or to what extent Peterson kind of biologizes or Darwinizes Jung, which is not to say that Jung's archetypes don't evolve. Certainly they do. The collective unconscious is an evolutionary inheritance, right? And the archetypes that populate that unconscious are themselves kind of like organisms in an ecology, and they evolve over time, or at least this is how I would read Jung. That being the case, even if we are going to evolutionize archetypes, then we don't know if the way that the masculine appears or the way that the feminine appears in culture and society at any given historical moment is the essential nature of those archetypes. It's an appearance of those archetypes. And those archetypes are engaged in an evolutionary ecological relationship, changing over time. New developments are arising, and I understand this perspective of evolution as the accumulation of strategies, successful strategies, and the sort of acquiring of these core characteristics that have proven to be highly adaptive. And the idea that we would want to change something too drastically and it might cause unintended consequences to sort of cascade out and lead to a system-wide collapse or something. There are certain conserved core strategies, core metabolic pathways, if you want to really literalize it or materialize it, that we have to be careful not to fuck with. I get that. And so in that sense, when Peterson talks about the masculine and the feminine and what has happened since the 60s with the women's movement and the sexual revolution, that we're playing with fire and we don't really know what we're messing with, I understand where he's coming from there. But playing with fire is what evolution is all about. Also, on the other hand, right? It's the conservation of these core capacities, and it's the continual experimentation, the confrontation with novelty, and the attempts to adapt to that novelty. And evolution is creative. It's not just human beings and human society that constructs new worlds, right? That's been the name of the game throughout the history of biological organisms on this life. And I would argue as a panpsychist that creativity is inbuilt into the very physical makeup of the cosmos. And so the evolutionary journey of creation and conservation of these core capacities goes all the way back to what we call the Big Bang, which is, I think, one way of talking about a process which is actually continuously creating. This is still the Big Bang, in other words. It's still happening. The idea that it was a beginning, like a start point, sometime in linear chronological time, it doesn't make logical sense. The beginning of time, so the Big Bang is still happening. It's an eternal event, and that's paradoxical, but perhaps paradox is what you encounter when you penetrate to the essential nature of reality. Maybe reality itself is paradoxical. It's an eternal event, an endless becoming. The author, the writer, Jorge Luis Borges says it quite wonderfully. He says, everything happens for the first time, but in a way that is eternal. Everything happens for the first time, but in a way that is eternal. So, anyways, archetypes are unconscious. Archetypes are evolving. For us to think that we could talk about the masculine and the feminine in some essentialized way, as though we knew what they were, and as though even if we could know what they were fixed in that state, I think is a mistake.